So the experience has this feeling of feeling more real than real, like you're perhaps connecting with some kind of divine reality. And this has this connection to near-death experiences, right? Where when some people, when they're near death, they experience this kind of going down a tunnel, interacting with divine beings in another place that feels real. And you've made this connection in your work, right, between DMT and the near-death experience.
Right. Well, I think when you refer to the beings or even the state, I'm not sure I would call it divine. I would call it, previously invisible. That's a little more generic, a little more neutral. Divine, divining, spirituality, foretelling, God, those kinds of things. Those are kind of loaded. But you can't argue with fact. That what you are witnessing was previously invisible. So that can include a whole spectrum of mechanisms or ideologies or bases of the experience. It could be completely physical, like your brain's been turned into a telescope of some sort or a microscope, and it exists in the physical world, just like energy or fields exist in the physical world, external to us. Because of the effects of the drug on your mind, brain consciousness, you're now able, to perceive levels of external reality that you couldn't before. It also includes, or it also, if you call these experiences previously invisible, it also can subsume purely brain generated ideologies, your brain on drugs, certain areas of your cortex are have been stimulated by 2A receptors and things like that. So it also can subsume psychological mechanisms. It's unconscious. It's your unconscious becoming conscious. So you're previously invisible, I think, captures the whole spectrum of what might be going on. One of the, theories that I had when I went into, to the research was that, to the extent that the DMT experience, of, giving, DMT, replicated or mimicked certain features of the near-death experience, that one could argue for a role of naturally occurring DMT in the NDE. So it was, one of those things. I was, talking earlier about the one mystical experience occurring in the one volunteer who really wanted a mystical experience, and he had studied it and was a religious studies major, was, working up, toward it for 20 years. The one volunteer whose DMT effect was the closest to an NDE was a nurse who was fascinated by the NDE. She had been studying it, reading books about it, interviewing people, was hoping for an NDE as a result of getting a big dose of DMT. So she was the only person in the study who went through, a tunnel. There was a light at the end of the tunnel. There were beings on either side, good ones and bad ones. I think it points to the fact that what you bring to the drug experience determines the drug experience itself. So it still is an interesting model, the whole idea of the DMT relationship to the near-death state. In my DMT book, I lay out a stress model of DMT release from the pineal gland at the time of death. That was reported. Actually, there were studies that came out of the University of Michigan, Jimo Borjigan and John Dean, a couple of years ago. Well, in 2013 at first, indicating DMT in the living mammalian pineal gland. So that supported my thinking about DMT and the pineal, and then 6 years later, the same group published some work demonstrating that the brain makes DMT, and maybe not the pineal. And brain levels of DMT increase by 3 to 5 times in the dying rodent brain. And the levels of DMT increase the most in the visual cortex of the dying animal. So that, points, to an interesting, correlation anyway, or an interesting association. If you think about the highly visual characteristics of the near-death experience, it could be a result at least of, or partially at least, of elevated levels of DMT in visual cortex. It's interesting as well because DMT is neuroprotective and neurostimulating. It enhances neurogenesis, neuroplasticity, reduces stroke, size in experimental animals. So if you think about brain injury, either as you're dying or from a stroke, requiring homeostatic mechanism being kicked into place, to heal or to at least slow damage. DMT is a good compound, and just by the way, DMT is incredibly psychedelic. So it starts, it starts to tie together on a number of loose ends about what's the role of DMT in the body, and what is the role of DMT in unusual states of consciousness.
Right. Yeah, and the work you mentioned is really fascinating. To see that there's strong evidence that there's DMT in the human brain, and yeah, I guess it's still not settled as to what it's doing in there, but plenty of interesting ideas. And when you first proposed the idea of the pineal producing DMT, you mentioned that it was kind of a nice way to tie together all this esoteric literature, on the pineal, and including Descartes' idea of this kind of the soul interacting with the material world through the pineal as well seems to fit nicely with that, especially with the idea of a soul leaving the body at death, and DMT being some kind of tied up in that in some way. But in the book, you're very clear that it's a kind of speculative hypothesis. But it seems that in the culture at large, in this kind of psychedelic culture, it's really the pineal meme has taken on a life of its own, and you see people kind of repeating kind of, scientists know for a fact that DMT is produced in the pineal, and then you get all this other kind of conspiracy theory stuff. What's your take on the life of its own that it's taken on?
Well, you can't control what people do with what you write. So I learned that at a certain point. I mean, Graham St. John is a Brit. I think he's in Switzerland, now, and has, written about, DMT as a, cultural meme. And he's got a, chapter on the pineal and, DMT. We, went back and forth in the chapter, or, in writing the chapter, or him writing the chapter about the DMT's, pineal connection, which I started back then. I get a lot of emails from people, saying my pineal gland is overactive. I'm, tripping out all the time, or I'm, decalcifying my pineal by, dental flossing my nose, and all kinds of things. That 2013 paper indicated that there was DMT in rodent pineal, but it actually probably is the case, at least in that study, that the probe that went in and out to get to the pineal gland snagged some brain tissue on its path, and it was your brain DMT, which was being measured or being detected. But I'm completely okay with the fact that the pineal may not make DMT. The fact that the brain does is even, more intriguing. And even if the experience of, whatever spiritual states occur around the area of the pineal, that doesn't mean it's the pineal gland on itself, which is being stimulated. The question of the DMT in the brain is interesting because the concentrations are as high as those for the canonical neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin. So there's are questions and studies being done to answer the question, or to provide answers regarding is there a DMT neurotransmitter system? Is DMT a neurotransmitter just like serotonin or like dopamine? And if that turns out to be the case, that'll be a very strange thing to consider. What is the role of a DMT neurotransmitter system? Neurotransmitters are responsible for consciousness, like everyday ongoing consciousness, our mood, our thinking, our awareness of the inner and outer world. So talk about ontological, talk about epistemological questions, I guess ontological ones too. It's going to raise some rather thorny issues. Terence McKenna used to say, or bemoan, or rue the fact that DMT was not on the front pages of the New York Times. That there's this chemical DMT that within a few heartbeats it takes you someplace completely else that feels more real than everything around us, and we don't know what it is doing in the human brain. But I think gradually the word is getting out about DMT, that it is in the brain and it has got these effects, stimulates the growth of nerve cells. I mean, that's pretty exciting.